Before the start of this video, if you are looking for any of these singles that I talk about today, make sure to check out my TCG Player affiliate link down below in the description. And by clicking on that link, and when you shop for those singles, I do get a small bonus. Another way you can support the channel is by becoming a patron member. There are some great benefits, as you can have your name on each video. You do have early access to videos, giveaways, deck advice and upgrades, and much more when you do join. And if anything else, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. That definitely goes a long way in supporting the channel. How's it going, YouTube? This is Devin from Jurassic Magic, and in this video today, I'm going to be discussing a new commander that is coming out of the Final Fantasy set. It is from the main set, not from the Commander Precon. Today, I will be discussing Sin, Spira's Punishment. This commander is pretty powerful. I love the design of this commander. This commander is pretty far from release. I believe Final Fantasy is coming out in the summer. We do have a little bit of a ways before the main set is going to be spoiled. However, I got super excited about this commander because of its uniqueness. Typically, I will make a commander deck out of a specific legendary within a set when it comes to spoiler time, or even a little bit after spoilers have been officially revealed, but I couldn't contain my excitement about this one. And so now with that said, let's get it started. Let's talk about this commander. So in total, Sin is 7 mana in Sultai color combination. It's a Leviathan avatar with flying with a 7/7 body. When it enters or attacks, exile a permanent card from your graveyard at random, then create a tap token that's a copy of that card. If the exiled card is a land card, repeat this process. So I do like how straightforward this ability is. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get some sort of effect. Obviously, it is going to be at random, which makes this commander a little bit more fair. If it just said choose a target card in your graveyard, it would be way more busted. But I am a big sucker for the way this card looks. The Leviathan looks absolutely menacing going after that ship. And again, I have no idea what's going on in this. I'm not a Final Fantasy person, but there are so many ways we could bust this in half. It kind of reminds me of a Cultivator Colossus. Instead of on top of your library, putting a land on the battlefield, it is going from your graveyard, making a token that's tapped on the battlefield. So like it, not really like it. It's kind of similar, but you can repeat the process when you put lands on the battlefield. And I do believe that's a good ability to build around. So there's a couple things I wanted to focus on in this deck specifically. Self-mill, so that way we can put lands or permanents onto the battlefield. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of a landfall theme, because of course the more lands we copy, the more we're going to be able to produce on the battlefield. Then I'll focus on some win cons. But now let's first focus on self-mill. So I first wanted to start off with a banger, because this is probably one of my favorite self-mill options that I've seen in a while with Palantir of Orthanc. For 3 mana, at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir and scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. So from a design space, this is going to benefit us either way, because we could get card draw, we get to also see what's on top of our library, or on the flip side, if we don't draw a card, one target opponent may lose a lot of life, because there could be some high mana cards that are on top of our library, or there could be lands. It's pretty Russian roulette, but either way, we're milling cards into our graveyard, so that way when we enter the battlefield or attack with our commander, we can put one of them on the battlefield randomly. So honestly, either side, this is going to be a win-win for us, and it's a permanent too. So when it goes to the graveyard and it gets exiled randomly, we get to put it onto the battlefield and go to our end step and get that trigger going. Another amazing self-mill option is Ripples of Undeath. This is only 2 mana for an enchantment, and at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. Then you may pay 1 and 3 life. If you do, put a card from among those cards into your hand, and most likely you don't necessarily need to do that. What you really want to do is put all those cards in the graveyard so that we can copy them later. This is going to be a heavy permanent deck, so that way we can take advantage of our commander's ability. The same can be applied for Cemetery Tampering. This is another great option because of the Hideaway 5. But most importantly, at the beginning of our upkeep, we may mill 3 cards. Then after there are 20 more cards in your graveyard, you may play the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. Most likely we'll have a ton of cards in our graveyard. We get to absolutely use that ability. And sure, we could cast something for free with that Hideaway ability. But if you want specific cards in your graveyard, let's just say you have no cards in your graveyard, you can use an option like Violent Tumor or Gravebreaker Lamia. Both of these cards can search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard. That's simple enough. But if you do want a repeatable way of using that Entomb-like effect, Orc Lore Mage is another excellent choice, because it's a tap ability. You can search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. Of course, it can buff itself up if it's an instant sorcery spell. Most likely, we're not going to have a lot of those in the deck, because we want as much permanence as we can. And something specifically to note, all these cards that I mentioned in this section are all permanents. These are all stuff that you could copy with your commander when it enters the battlefield or attacks. So these are all great options that you could utilize. Of course, there are also a lot of other self-mill options. I put the deck list down below in the description if you do want to go check it out, so that you can see all the options that I do have in store. But now I wanted to shift my focus into Landfall because, of course, with our commander, we're making more token copies of permanents, and if we get more lands on the battlefield off of that ability, we get to repeat this process as much as we want. So the most notable thing about Landfall is the fact that whenever a land enters the battlefield, you get some sort of effect like Lotus Cobra or even Tireless Provisioner. These provide great mana resources. Lotus Cobra is cheaper, however Tireless Provisioner does provide a treasure or a food token. Most likely you're going to be using it for a treasure token. And what's very neat about these ones specifically is we could get a burst of insane amount of mana, because let's just say we had like 5 or 6 lands in our graveyard, then our commander attacks or enters the battlefield. We get to put all those lands tapped onto the battlefield, and we get all these triggers of either getting mana floating in there with Lotus Cobra or even 6 treasure tokens. You could also go wide with the token army like Rampaging Baloths or even Scoot Swarm, and you could even throw an Avenger of Zendikar. All these are great because when lands enter the battlefield, you get a token creature, whether it's a 4/4 beast, a little 1/1 insect that's the Scoot Swarm, or even a lot of plant tokens that you could buff up each time a land enters the battlefield. Each of these are also great, so that way you could just kind of overrun your opponents. You could also drain your opponents for a serious amount of damage with like Iridescent Vine Lasher or even Retreat to Hagra. Iridescent Vine Lasher, you can make an extra token copy, and whenever a land enters the battlefield, you deal 1 damage to the opponent. But I do believe Retreat to Hagra might be a little better option because each opponent will lose 1 life and you gain 1 life. But you can increase the damage input with something like Ob Nixilis the Fallen. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target player lose 3 life. If you do, you put 3 1/1 counters on Ob Nixilis the Fallen. So let's just say somebody's very ahead in the game and you have about like 7 or 8 lands in your graveyard. Well, if you have Ob Nixilis out on the battlefield and then you cast your commander when it enters the battlefield, you repeat the process of making those land tokens on the battlefield, and which in return will make Ob Nixilis absolutely huge that you could swing in with and make an opponent lose a ton of life. You could also double the landfall triggers by using Ancient Green Warden. This is another excellent choice. You could play lands from your graveyard. That's okay. We're mostly trying to get lands into our graveyard so we can repeat our commander's ability, but most importantly, if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So basically all those landfall effects, just imagine doubling them. That seems quite insane. And not only that, there is a lot of ETB triggers that we could take advantage of, so doubling effects is going to be critical. Our commander itself does have an ETB trigger, so we could take advantage of Panharmonicon like effects, so that way we could double its ability when it enters the battlefield. And what's pretty neat about Panharmonicon like effects is any of those landfall triggers are going to be doubled too, because whenever a land enters the battlefield, that will trigger Panharmonicon itself and those other things very similar to that effect. The same can be applied for token doubling effects like Parallel Lives or even Doubling Season, where instead of getting 1 land, you'll get 2 lands, and you could double any permanent that enters the battlefield as long as it's not legendary. I also find Second Harvest to be very powerful. Let's just say for a quick example, you have like 15 lands on the battlefield, which is not impossible by the way, especially with our commander. With Second Harvest, for each token you control, put a token on the battlefield that's a copy of that permanent, which means instead of 15 lands, you're getting 30 lands, and especially if they're great utility lands, more the merrier. Really, the sky is the limit with this commander. It is super powerful. I do believe token doubling effects and also ETB triggers are going to help you close out the game, and this just kind of makes me a little sad inside because I would love for this commander to have red in its color identity, mainly because I love Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, and I feel like this would be an amazing Valakut deck, but unfortunately that is not the case. It is in Sultai color combination, which still is pretty good, but I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts down below in the comments? Do you plan on building this commander for yourself? What other strategies would you follow along with this commander? Again, I love how unique this design is, focusing on making token copies of permanents that are random from your graveyard to the battlefield, and of course you can play like Russian Roulette if it's like a land card, or if it's a regular permanent card. You might want to play more lands than your typical landfall deck, just so that you could get more lands on the battlefield on top of what you're getting. So if there's any other commanders that you would like me to build around from Final Fantasy, let me know down below in the comments. So if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.